Should I share my screen? Okay, I will share my screen. Don't look at my porn. Lilith by Vladimir Nabokov. I died. The sycamores gave shade. Shutters were shut upon the dust of the hot streets, steamily teased by the torrid Aeolus. I slowly walked, and the fawns walked. It seemed as though I recognized the great god Pan in every fawn. Good. I must be in paradise. Shielding her face against the sun, there stood a naked, slender girl. Her honeyed skin attracted me. Lilies were treaded in her curls. She had the grace of a woman. I watched her small nipples harden, and I recall the sweet springtime in another new-grown garden. Trees by the river I had one time watched, emboldened the miller's youngest daughter step out of the water, lithe, golden, with a damp wisp between her legs. And now, still wearing the coat I had on when murdered last night, with a rake's predatory gloat, I advanced upon my Lilith. She stared at me with her green eyes until my clothes burst into flame and burnt to ashes in a trice. The room behind her, I saw a Greek divan, a spread-out shawl, a table, pomegranates, wine, some erotic art covering the wall. With 2 fingers, she shamelessly took hold of my hot member's head with unself-conscious, childish glee. Now come along with me, she said. Without inducement or effort, but slowly to extend delight. Like wings, she gradually opened her soft, sweet brown thighs to my sight. How enticing, how inviting. Her moist pink rose. With a wild cry, she fell on my throbbing length, slicker than that remembered child. Snake in snake, vessel in vessel, smooth fitting parts I moved in her through ascending rhythms, feeling unendurable pleasure stir. But she suddenly flinched and pushed me off her, moved fast, stood over me, grasped the shawl and twisted around her waist and up, covered and strong again, with me about to come to spend, for me, nothing left. A strange wind made me stagger. I ran to the door. Let me in! I shouted, noticing with horror that I stood outside in the dust where loudly yelling youngsters were staring at my engorged lust. Let me come in! And the goat-hoofed crowd increased. Quick, let me come in! I'm about to come, I yelled. The door stayed shut. The crowd watched, quiet, as I spurted out my semen. I knew then that I was in hell.
So would you say more or less extreme?
I think that is definitely more explicit than Lolita ever was, because there was no like sexual content. I mean, there was attempted grooming, yes, and he did get descriptive, but there was nowhere near this level. I will say that it is oddly satisfying in the sense it goes into all the, again, Vladimir's very explicit. He's not afraid to pull his punches, even in his tamer works. And this was a good example of that. But the satisfaction, I feel, comes into play when he goes into all this detail. This horrible man who, whatever interpretation you can draw from the fact that he got murdered, whether it was because in his life he creeped on this adolescent girl, probably raped her in a bout of pedophilic lust. Maybe the murderer was her father. I mean, Nabokov kind of leaves a lot to interpretation. But anyway, what worse torture for someone who likes children a little too much than to trick them into thinking that that they went to heaven. This is what they get to do for the rest of their life. They end up doing some of it, but then at the end, it's what every pedophile does not want to happen to them. For not only their sexual desires to be repressed, but also for them to get found out. Everyone's watching. everyone's looking at them, everyone knows their secrets, and their life is over. Now, whether he literally went to paradise or not, I mean, like I said, I think from what it described, I mean, he said he was murdered, so pretty sure he did die. But you could also take it as if he is still alive. I mean, same story told differently. His hell.
I did not consider that. That's a very, very interesting point. If you consider that the murder hasn't happened yet, and it's actually just a telling what he did to end up murdered. That would be that's actually kind of an interesting idea. This is really good.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, especially by the end, that's what I gathered. I hate to repeat myself, but again, the worst fate imaginable for, I mean, you see it in our culture nowadays.
Kind of person, yeah.
That is hell for the worst kind of person imaginable. You see that in culture nowadays. Whenever information gets out that someone possibly did stuff with a minor, their life is on thin ice. If it turns out,
that was the thing I find most fascinating about this, though. When eventually released to the public, this was actually written years early. It eventually gets released to the public during his lifetime. He explicitly tells the public to ignore any connections to his later work, which is very weird to me because it's very obvious that it has some sort of leaning to his later works like Lolita, like Ada. And it really makes me wonder why he's trying to shy away from that, Because it might just be that it conflicts with the story that he tells, because he explains that he got the idea for Lolita maybe a year or two before he wrote the book, or before it was published. But it's very clear if you pay attention to his writing that the concept was in his mind 10 years earlier. He just hadn't written it yet. I find that interesting.
Yeah, very, very much so. My guess as to why he would not want this work to be associated with Lolita is, I don't know. I think it might just be the simple fact that these stories are pretty similar, and he didn't want people getting them confused. Is this from the same canon as Lolita? Is this within the same story? He didn't want to cause confusion or something, because this compared to Lolita, I do. From what I remember, I think Lolita is a lot tamer, just because it's more subtle grooming and not outright child rape.
Yeah, especially since like I said, the only reason I know about this poem is from a video where someone delves deep into what the dude wrote about, right? And what I find most interesting is that as the years go on, his public work gets more explicit about writing about these things. Like how you mentioned, Lolita is very flowery about it. He becomes very much less flowery about it with each passing book.
In a way, this is kind of like the opposite of Lolita in terms of very much so in intensity, because where Lolita was an experimental piece. The reason it has the flowery language is so readers might be tricked into thinking Humbert is doing nothing wrong, because people are still very convinced by people who seem to have a squeaky clean image and a way with the words, that they ignore all the horrible shit they do. And I think that's what Nabokov was trying to do in Lolita. It's in a way, the horrible marketing for Lolita kind of pushed that fact even further, because the way Lolita was marketed with its covers and everything, it painted the picture of just a typical love story when it was so far from the fact.
But I will note that the quote that people often attribute, that it's attributed correctly. The quote about him saying no girls, only flowery colors and all that. That was very explicitly for the time that he said it, because at the time that he said it, books that were more artsy and didn't really have explicit this is a character on it were considered like high class literature, while like more of the poppy, like for the lower folks reading would have like poses and stuff like that. And if you look for it, there is an interview like done later on where like right around when the movie comes out, where he's like, "Oh yeah, look at all these book covers. I really appreciate like how they designed this and designed that." And they're like the same books that people say that he's rolling in his grave about. So I do want to clarify that.
Okay, okay. I was thinking if he was cool with that, I think that's actually pretty genius. You know, advertising your thing as like, oh, like a young adult, like romance kind of thing with this very stand up guy, but he turns out to be a child groomer. And you got to kind of figure that out yourself. You're kind of dissecting a very disturbing plot veiled as a typical romance story. But anyway, what I was saying was about this, comparing this to uh, Lilith, which that's probably also why he said he didn't want the two stories to be compared, because Lilith and Lilith and Lolita are kind of similar in name, not too similar, but like they both start with L. They kind of got a little, they kind of have multiple syllables, stuff like that. So that's probably another reason. But anyway, while Lolita was meant to be experimental, kind of like, you know, trying to kind of trick the reader and stuff like that into showing a more disturbing plot. I think this one was more like, you know, meant to be more explicit on purpose, like to show the real horrors, of what goes on through some people's heads. Which I'm glad this one didn't pull any punches. Like I said, I think that just delivers more of the impact.